Time for another Veterans vs Historians video. This one is quite different. In the first video I looked at German veterans' statements about the Soviet Katyusha rocket launcher and compared them to statements by historians, which in the end showed that there was actually quite a match. In this video we look at the memoirs of Belton Cooper titled Death Traps, the survival of an American armored division in World War II, and contrast it with statements from historians and technical data. First off, it is also important to point out that the name on the cover of the book might be misleading. In an interview with Tank and AFV News in 2015, Steven Zaloga noted the following. To begin with, it's ghost written. It's not only Belton Cooper, it's the ghostwriter talking as well. It's very hard to distinguish Belton Cooper's stuff from the ghostwriters. I've talked to Belton Cooper a number of times, and the problem is that by the time that Belton Cooper got to write the book, he was quite a bit older. His memories were not just all that good, so a lot of the stuff that is in the book didn't even come out of his mouth. Due to this, I will avoid using Belton Cooper various points in this video. Instead, I will use the author, since that seems to be a more precise and fair statement based on the information provided by Zaloga. I will use Belton Cooper when it is about points that are more directly related to his biography. But we can't be certain that he really made these statements. Yet there are more aspects that are very important to consider when dealing with this book. First, it is from the days before almost everyone in the Western world had access to the internet. It was originally published in 1998, the same year Google started. In contrast, Wikipedia was created in January 2001. In those days, the amount of information was very limited online, or in some cases non-existent. To illustrate this, let us look at the M4 Sherman page from Wikipedia. According to the page statistics on the M4 Sherman page on Wikipedia, the article was first edited by a user named Karen Johnson on the 27th July 2002, but the page notes that some information might be incorrect. Additionally, to the merging of articles, there might have been early entries as well. Anyway, the entry was: the Sherman tank, officially called the M4A3 Sherman tank or the M4 Sherman tank, was the main battle tank designed and built by the US for the use in World War II. As of 20 February 2022, the statistics note that the page had a total of 4,522 edits and 1,468 editors, with the latest edit happening on 16 February 2022. In other words, fact-checking in those days had to be done quite differently. Additionally, I assume that at that point very few people actually were aware how flawed the human memory is. So the idea of fact-checking memoirs in particular likely was out of question as well. Another point noted by Zaloga is the following. I don't mean Belton Cooper anything ill, but the problem is that it's not a very representative account of tank fighting in World War II. It's from the perspective of an ordnance officer, not a tank officer. And it somewhat distorts people's perception of what tank fighting was like in World War II. Cooper's job was to organize the maintenance of US tanks, and not just those that broke down, but those that were shot up by the Germans. As such, in his function he saw a lot of destroyed Allied tanks, especially since he served in the American 3rd Armored Division. Why is the last bit important? Well, according to Zaloga, the 15 US armored divisions in the European theater of operations lost a total of 2,659 Shermans. The 3rd lost the most with 632 Shermans, followed by the 7th with 360 and the 4th with 316. In other words, the 3rd lost about 23.8% of all Sherman losses within the armored divisions. In total, 4,295 Shermans were lost in the European theater of operations. So of all Sherman losses in Europe, the 3rd Armored Division still accounted for 14.7%. So basically, Belton Cooper likely saw more destroyed Shermans than anyone else. And if this was not the case, he very likely knew the person that see more destroyed Sherman than he did. Maybe not the best analogy, but I think it comes close. This would be like writing a book about human behavior using solely the YouTube comment section as a source. As Zaloga notes, he could see it from the very grim reality of repairing knocked out and damaged tanks. But he was not a tank officer. He was an ordnance officer. He was involved in tank maintenance. First, let us look at some major errors. What is rather jarring is that basic vehicle data is wrong, and not just for the German tanks but also for the US ones. There's of course the grass is always greener on the other side effect, but in this book several times values for German equipment are given with better numbers and US equipment with lower numbers. So we are not just talking about different perceptions here. The Mark IV was a smaller low-profile tank that weighed only 22 tons compared to our M4's 37.5 tons. It had 4 inches, which is 10.16 cm of armor on the vertical part of its glacis plate and a wider track than the M4. These numbers are off in both directions, at least if one uses the models used in summer 1944. Zaloga notes a combat weight of 26 metric tons for the Panzer IV Ausführung H and 30.3 metric tons for the M4A1. Some of these numbers are likely due to conversion errors. Zaloga also lists the US tons for the M4A1 and those are 33.4. But that is still more than 10% away from the 37.5 tons mentioned by the authors. Now 4 inches of armor translate to 10.16 cm or 102 mm. Yet according to Spielberger, the highest value for any armored plate on the Panzer IV for any variant was 80 mm. So the authors are off by 25 or 20% depending on the fact if you take the historical 80 mm or the fictional 102 mm as a base value. One might argue this is a minor error and one might convince me about that if it was a singular instance. But this happens again and again with the data for the guns as well. The original Mark IV had a short barreled gun similar to the 75 M2 on our M4s. Its muzzle velocity was 1500 feet per second, which is about 475 meters per second. These were replaced on the Panzerkampfwagen IV by a 75 mm Kampfwagenkanone 41 gun with a much higher velocity, 3000 feet per second, which is about 940 meters per second. Yet the 75 mm M3 gun on the Sherman had a barrel length of 38 calibers according to Zaloga, whereas Wikipedia notes 40. Yet both values are far closer to the 48 caliber of the long-barreled Panzer IV gun than the 24 calibers of the short-barreled Panzer IV. Of course, the caliber length alone might be misleading, so let us look at the muzzle velocity of these three guns as well. The 75 mm M3 gun at 690 meters per second or 2031 feet per second, with the M72 AP shell according to Wikipedia. This seems to be in line with what Zaloga notes, namely 620 to 625 meters per second. For the German 7.5 cm Kampfwagenkanone 40 with 48 caliber length, he notes 704 to 790 meters per second, that is about 2310 to 2592 feet per second. Meanwhile, the German 7.5 cm KWK 37 with the 24 caliber length had a muzzle velocity of just 385 meters per second, so 1260 feet per second. So the authors clearly overstated the actual muzzle velocity of the German guns and understated the barrel length of the Sherman. There are more errors in that regard. Let us look at some claims now about the knowledge and distribution of knowledge. The following statement is probably impossible to verify or deny, yet keep in mind for the following quotes. As the only officer in the maintenance battalion who had been at tank maintenance school in Fort Knox, I was knowledgeable about tanks, particularly their technical capabilities. Cooper then follows to state that he tried to be as best informed as possible. At tank school, which is the Armored Force School at Fort Knox, I took copious notes and read every field manual I could get my hands on. I also read any G2, which is the military intelligence ordnance reports we had on German tanks. Unfortunately, this information was limited. I saw no reports on German tanks larger or more powerful than the Panzerkampfwagen III and the Panzerkampfwagen IV with the short-barreled 75 mm howitzer. We had no information about the German Panther tank either, although I had read a newspaper account of the Tiger tanks that were used in North Africa against the 1st Armored Division. Sadly, I could not find out when exactly Cooper was at tank school, but he noted that he became active duty in June 1941. at least at that point the Panzer IV with the short-barreled 75mm gun was still completely up to date. Yet since he also mentions the Tiger tank in North Africa, this means the view is likely not restricted to the time frame of him being at tank school. In North Africa, the Tiger saw first action early December 1942. The question is if the claim of getting no further information is valid. For this, let us take a short look at the US journal Tactical and Technical Trends. Tactical and Technical Trends was published by US Military Intelligence Service in World War II from June 1942 to June 1945. Publication was initially bi-weekly and later monthly. The first issue of Tactical and Technical Trends from June 1942 has a distribution list that included various entries. Probably most relevant were Tactical and Technical Consultants, Armored Force, Tank Destroyer Command and Divisions. I assume that Cooper during tank school likely might not have access to those, but in the field I assume this should have been less of a problem. Of course, it is hard to tell if Cooper had access or not. I would assume he probably could get his hands on it. But even if this was not the case, this is mainly irrelevant. He was an officer in charge of maintenance, as information about foreign tanks is irrelevant for him. And just because he could not get his hands on them for whatever reason does not mean we had no information about the German Panther tank either. It just means he did not have that information. Furthermore, if we look at Tactical and Technical Trends, we see various entries like for the assault gun, the Stuck 3 with the short barrel gun. The Tiger is already mentioned in March 1943, with armor values that seem to be mostly correct. In the same issue, the Panzer IV with the long-barreled 75mm gun is also mentioned and depicted, and there are two possible muzzle velocity mentioned, 2400 and 2620 feet per second, which are certainly in the correct range of values in contrast to the values provided in the book. Although in all fairness, we also need to consider the following. Bruce Newsome, in his book about the Tiger tank in Allied intelligence, makes an interesting point about certain problems with dissemination of information about the Tiger. Nevertheless, the German propagandists did not lie. They did not exaggerate the gun size, for instance. This credibility and the irregularity and thinness of Allied intelligence that reached the lowest echelons through summer 1943, despite the excellence of intelligence at the highest echelons, helps to explain why Western soldiers were already injured in German propaganda when Western propagandists and politicians tried to disparage the Tiger. In October 1943, the heavy tank destroyer Ferdinand is shown with various technical data provided, and in November 1943 the Panther tank as well. Sadly, I don't know a work that covers how various publications like Tactical and Technical Trends were disseminated in the US Army and if Cooper in his position would have qualified for access. His statements are clearly too broad and misleading. The next points are more of minor grievances. Here the first part is about the claim that historians have failed to portray certain aspects. This is one of the greatest tragedies of World War II, and most historians have completely failed to understand this point. Had it not been for the Ordnance maintenance crews and the maintenance crews of armored regiments, the divisions couldn't have survived and be maintained as a viable combat unit until the end of the war. I'm not too aware about the US historiography about the Second World War up to 1998 and before, but according to Zaloga and my own impressions, it does not seem that the authors of the book were particularly well versed in that regard. As such, that claim of historians having failed seemed rather unfounded. I did also a bit of digging and looked into the Green Army books to quote, regardless of the administrative problems relating to echelons of maintenance and the control of repair shops, the one lesson of the war that stood out above all others from the maintenance point of view was that troops must learn maintenance discipline as well as combat discipline. Then again, this is just one small part in a book series with a total of 78 volumes originally published in 1946. I can fully understand that Cooper or his ghostwriters did not see this aspect of the war properly represented in the public discourse, and it very likely was not, but in my opinion this is not due to historians failing to understand the point, but a lack of public interest in maintenance and logistics. The next part is about the numerous designation errors for both US and German equipment. The authors again and again refer to the 75mm gun of the Sherman as M2, yet according to Honeycutt and Zaloga it was the M3. Even for the early production models. Similarly, for German equipment, the German anti-tank gun PaK-41 is constantly mentioned. The problem is the PaK-41 was very rare, whereas the PaK-40 was the main anti-tank gun of the Germans in the war, as covered in this video on my main channel. Similarly, the long barreled gun on the Panzer IV is called KWK-41, although it was the KWK-40. I mean, one could argue that it is at least consistently wrong, and it also seems to follow a pattern. Remember that I stated in the major error that in the book generally there are better values provided for the German equipment and worse numbers for the US equipment? It seems this pattern even continues to the designation numbers, since German equipment is increased by 1 point, whereas for the US at least the gun is decreased by 1 point. This of course raises the question if someone was just trolling. The author also messes up the Sherman designations. The M4A1 was shown next. It was essentially the same tank as the M4 but with an improved high velocity 76mm gun and a different turret to accommodate it. The issue is the naming difference is about the hull, not the gun. The M4 had a welded hull whereas the M4A1 had a cast hull. Shermans with the M4A1 could be equipped with the 75mm but also with the 76mm gun. To quote Honeycutt, the T1 gun was also standardized as the 76mm gun M1, and this was added in parentheses to the tank's designation when it was armed with this weapon. For example, an M4A1 armed with the 76 became a medium tank M4A1 76 M1. Although one must add here that the US naming system for tank variants in World War II is probably the most complicated one, besides a few oddities on the German side, like naming the Panther variants with non-sequential letters. Anyway, before I conclude this video, be aware that I found various more points where I'm actually not sure if they are correct or not, but I hadn't time to cross-check them yet. To summarize, the main problem with the book Death Traps is that it contains a myriad of errors, comes from a perspective that is by its nature heavily skewed to the position of Belton Cooper. As such, this book, as is the case for many memoirs in my opinion, but especially with this one, is ideally only used by people that already have a strong understanding and knowledge of the topics in question. It can provide new insights and perspectives for experts, but at the same time, it is extremely misleading to people that lack context and the basics or even moderate knowledge of the topics covered. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, sources are listed in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.